Thank you all for coming. So today we have World Salon on how DOGE affects EPA deregulation, balancing economic growth and environmental protection. And first, we'll do some quick introductions. So, David, you want to introduce yourself real quick? We'll go in order that we'll do some questions in a little bit.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to speak. I'm David Woolley. I direct the Environmental Center at the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley. And I manage a center that focuses on policy-related research on climate and energy.
And Miriam, would you like to go next?
I'm Miriam Diamond. I'm at the University of Toronto in Toronto, Canada. I'm a professor of environmental chemistry. Toxics are my business. I look at nasty chemicals all the way from their sources through to how they move in the environment, how we're exposed. And I'm also involved in chemicals management from national to international scales and arenas. Thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
And Chris?
Yeah, thank you, Derek, and hello, everybody. My name is Chris Frey. I am at North Carolina State University, where I'm a chaired professor of environmental engineering. But I think the reason I'm here is because I was recently assistant administrator of the Office of Research and Development at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And although most of my career has been in academia, I've interacted with EPA as an external science advisor and as a researcher over more than 3 decades.
Great, thank you. And as the last member of the band, I'm Derek Lemoyne, a professor of economics at University of Arizona. A lot of my work's been around climate change and how do you price climate emissions? What are the damages from climate change? How do we know what they are? Questions like that. Great, so thank you. So we'll do some guided questions now, and we'll start with David. And I gotta find the guided question for David in my sheet. All right, so David, given your extensive analysis of deregulation during the Trump administration, what key recommendations would you offer policymakers to effectively maintain environmental protection, promote sustainable economic growth, and simultaneously strengthen the U.S. role in global climate and plastic pollution negotiations?
Well, thanks for that. That's a good question. And my sense is that, for one thing, it's very important to take the threats that are posed by the Trump administration very seriously. We could see catastrophic impacts on clean and affordable energy and the ability to reduce emissions, including greenhouse gas emissions. They're trying to wreck the Inflation Reduction Act funding, which Congress made available to seed a wide range of domestic industry and manufacturing into lower costs. They're firing everybody with a brain at the Department of Energy, Department of Interior, and Environmental Protection Agency. I should add that I'm on an informal advisory committee to the administrator for the Clean Air Act, but we haven't been asked to weigh in on anything yet. The tariffs are driving the U.S. economy into a recession or worse. And when the economy is in bad shape, there's less resources available to fund emission reductions and decarbonization. The loss of supply chains will make it harder to do renewable energy in the United States and to weaken the ability to expand data centers and AI. It's going to raise the cost of electric vehicles. I looked at the 31 actions announced by the EPA administrator. And I wanted to read this quote from the administrator's press release, which goes something like this. Now I can't find it. Well, quote, "We are driving a dagger straight into the heart of climate change religion. To drive down the cost of living for Americans, unleash American energy, and bring jobs back." Well, there are several problems with that quote. First of all, the Dracula analogy is nonsensical. If climate change is just a myth like vampires, why do we have to work so hard to kill it? And then the other thing is that if they wanted to drive down the cost of living for Americans, the last thing you would do is completely upset global supply chains that Americans use every day, and that will not reduce the cost of living, but very likely increase it. He's talking about unleashing American energy. but we're at record levels of oil and gas production, manufacturing of batteries, all kinds of things. I'm not sure what he's planning to unleash. And bringing jobs back just seems completely a non sequitur. So policymakers, I think, have a really important responsibility here. One is to resist these changes. Now, not all of them are bad. I looked at the 31 actions proposed by the administrator, and some of them might make sense, but I think a lot of them don't. And I think it's important that policymakers take the opportunity not only to resist, but also to educate the public about these issues. Now, the other thing I would say to policymakers is that there are some reasons for hope here. Remember, I would ask them to remember that the momentum toward deep reductions in greenhouse gases and other harmful air pollutants is very strong worldwide and probably unstoppable. One example is one of the so-called hard to decarbonize sectors. Negotiations are underway this week to reduce greenhouse gases from ocean-going vessels. This is an inventory of about 1 billion tons a year. And there's a lot of interest in doing that, including from the industry that would be regulated by that agreement. Wind, solar, batteries are the dominant increase in electric power generation pretty much all over the world at this point. Europe, Japan, China are developing extended supply chains for electric vehicles, batteries, alternative fuel supplies. I mentioned earlier the Inflation Reduction Act, and the thing that's important to remember here is that most of that money is out the door. And while they may be able to claw some of it back, we've got funding for about 3 to 5 years of really important work to do with that funding. And they've had the new administration's had limited success so far in pulling it back. A second reason for optimism is that, frankly, I think that the plans coming out of the Trump administration to weaken EPA, to weaken the effort toward clean energy will likely be temporary, and in another way may completely fail to be implemented. For example, the proposal to reconsider the endangerment finding under the Federal Clean Air Act. This is an important step that EPA took years ago to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles and others. To me, that looks like a fool's errand. I think it's very unlikely that the administrator or what's left of EPA would be able to convince anyone that greenhouse gas emissions are harmless. A couple of other things here. We've got the midterms coming up. It seems likely to me that the Republicans will lose control in the House given the current behavior. The idea that the federal government can attack state climate laws, I just don't think that's going to be very likely. Michael Girard from the Columbia Sabin Center basically put it succinctly in the New York Times quote, presidents do not have the power to unilaterally annul state laws. New York Times described this announcement, I think they called it an executive order, a news release with no legal authority. So I think that we're in a place where some of these things may not come to fruition, or may not actually be very effective. And so I think, I imagine that there are a lot of people in the audience that are students or people young in their career. And I got some advice for them, and I think that this is equally applicable to policymakers, is that in these kinds of times when there was great attacks from the White House on environmental protection, there was a return to the states, and the states have always been the innovators and leaders on environmental protection and climate. And I think in addition to these days, there's a rising importance of cities and local governments. And so there's a lot we can do working with states and local government to maintain this momentum. So I hope I didn't go over. Thank you all for listening.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. And I should have mentioned that if anybody has questions, please put them in the Q&A, because I mean, we're happy to engage with audience questions on as we go through the guided questions, then again at the end of everybody's questions. Chris or Miriam, do either of you have a quick follow-up that you would like to add to anything he said?
Well, I think there's a tremendous amount to pick up on. I guess one thing I'll pick up on is, the current administration is posing that there's a antithesis between environmental growth and protecting public health and the environment, and that's simply not supported by any evidence. I'll give two examples. One, EPA has a really nice graphic that shows on a relative basis several indicators of economic growth and environmental quality improvement. And, for example, since 1970, energy consumption in the U.S. has increased by 50%. The population has doubled. The gross domestic product has tripled. And yet during that time, we've had an 80% reduction in the emissions of several key criteria pollutants that affect public health and the environment. Another example is there was a study of the benefits and costs of the Clean Air Act that found that for every dollar spent on Clean Air Act compliance and controls, there were $30 of benefits. Some of this is avoided premature death and avoided illness, but also, returning to beneficial use, recreational areas and reducing haze in the Grand Canyon and many, many other indicators. So it's just not supported by evidence that regulations are a job killer. They might have implications for transfers in the economy, but there's also a lot of industrial and small business innovation that supports economic growth consistent with these regulatory policies. And in fact, there's a number of studies that show regulations are a driver of innovation and economic growth. So I'll stop there.
I had a similar comment that the evidence shows that regulations actually promote economic growth. We want to move forward into a future in which we have innovative, clean technologies that accompany a clean environment from the air and water, the air we breathe, the water we drink. I can't foresee a future in which we go backwards to dirty technologies with the misguided belief that that's actually going to increase prosperity. But I'm not going to say more because that'll just take up all the other remarks that I was going to say.
Great. On that note, I will also not say more in the interest of time because I have remarks coming as well. I will move to Miriam because you're next. So you get to bleed directly into what you were going to say. So I think what we're looking at is, given that agencies like NOAA and EPA are changing pretty rapidly, how do you think this is going to be able to affect the United States and maybe other countries' ability to affect crises like biodiversity, climate change, any chemical pollution, anything else that you might care about?
Yeah, thanks, Derek. Well, first, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak and also for the opportunity to learn, because I really appreciate the comments that are coming through and the clear thinking that is being provided today. I want to set the backdrop of a bit of what's going on. So for many years, I've been following the relationship. Oh, and I should say, I'm not an economist, so I hope I'm not going out of my lane. But anyways, the backdrop is that there's a very close tie between prosperity and what's called energy return on energy invested. So how much energy you get back when you put in an investment of energy. For example, if you drill a well in your backyard and you manage to you hit some sweet oil that can be, that's very clean and can be burned easily, you get a tremendous, you're recouping a lot of money from that. Well, this ratio of how much energy we get back from how much effort we have to put into getting that energy has been consistently going down. It's been going down since, I don't know, the 1930s, 1940s. But that is one of the underlying currents of how our prosperity in general is decreasing. And the reason why I'm mentioning that is because it's sowing the seeds of discontent. Because it is a decrease in prosperity. Renewables, although there's a lot of debate about it, are unlikely to provide that same type of energy return on energy invested. So that's a scary, that's a prospect that we need to grapple with. The second underlying current that I wanted to mention is that we have the internet that was supposed to bring people together and build communities and so on. But because of the algorithms, it's pulling us apart and it's making us very polarized, very angry, and it's fragmenting our brains. I also think that what the internet is doing is reducing our ability to think critically, to actually be able to sift through information and to be able to come up with our own assessments. Unfortunately, as a student of looking at what the internet has done, I anticipate that artificial intelligence is going to further weaken our ability to understand and distinguish truth from fiction and to be able to really look at the complex problems that confront us. I'm not just thinking of the information you pull up, I'm thinking about how our brains are changing. Because believe me, I've seen that over my career of teaching students. So given this backdrop of societal discontent as a result of decreasing prosperity, and my concern about the lack of critical thinking, that diminishment, we're grasping for simple solutions. So David, you spoke about that quote, that simple solution. We simply drive the dagger through regulations and presto, we're going to get this magic increase in prosperity and we're going to bring jobs back and everything's going to be fantastic. The big flaw, David, as you said, and Chris, it's not evidence-based. There's no evidence to support that myth. Yet, we pride ourselves on being intelligent and making decisions informed on evidence. Okay, so let's move. I forgot to be watching the time. So let's move to the implications of deregulation and the dismantling of the EPA and NOAA. So from my reading this is highly political. It is not aimed at increasing efficiency. It's rather being aimed at cowing independent, but science-based evidence. It's cowing our very ability to think critically, to innovate, and to come up with important, needed solutions for this triple planetary crisis that we're in the midst of. Climate change, loss of biodiversity, and pollution. The triple planetary crisis. We need all brains and hands on deck right now to solve this problem at the very time that the Trump administration is attacking universities and is attacking our brain trust in institutions such as the EPA and NOAA. In the short term, the repercussions from some of those 31 promised reviews of regulations that David mentioned is going to be poor air quality. And Chris, you mentioned this too. So right now, the administration has its targets on evidence-based regulations aimed at protecting human health from particulate matter, PM 2.5, from emissions from the, sorry, I have to check my, emissions from the energy and manufacturing sectors. How much mercury is emitted from power plants? Those regulations are based on so much scientific evidence. The cost is to individuals in terms of decreased health and the cost to society of those individuals that have to seek health care and the loss of productivity. In the longer term, and we talked about also that the impact on innovation. So in the longer term, it's the impact on innovation. Countries like China are going to town on this. They're investing huge amounts of money in their academic institutions, in their government institutions. They have environmental regulations. They see the importance of renewable energy, and they have put in place solutions to get to a cleaner, lower pollution future. We are going backwards, which is pretty crazy. So in the long term, we're losing that innovative capacity. We're losing the brain trust. And I'm just going to end because I bet my time is up. A lot of these are, Derek, were you going to say something? Is my time up?
That's right. Sorry, my mic was muted and I didn't realize that. Yes, we're right about it.
Can I just finish up?
Yes. Yep. Say something.
Okay. So a lot of this is being promoted by those who are very wealthy and who can afford to control the public discourse. But my comment is, even the rich, even those who are wealthy, have to breathe air and drink clean water.
Great.
That's
Thank you
all
for
I want.
sharing your thoughts. Trinity has a question that I'm going to defer to after Chris speaks, because I think it will bring together a few of the conversations we've had so far. I want to give people time to think about that. But I will, in the interest of time, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Chris now, and we'll circle back around to Trinity's question after Chris speaks. So Chris, your question is again closely linked to what Miriam was just talking about. And so how would workforce reductions impact the ability of the EPA and maybe other agencies to perform the duties that they might want to be performing?
Yeah, thanks, Derek, and thanks, Miriam and David. So I'm going to give just a little bit of context for how I'm going to answer Derek's question, because the role I had from 2021 to 2024, I was on leave from my university to serve in the political leadership of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, including I was a Senate-confirmed assistant administrator, and I headed the Office of Research and Development. And some of you may have seen news stories that the EPA, the current EPA political leadership, is planning to dissolve the Office of Research and Development and lay off 50 to 75% of its 1,500 federal employees. And by the way, ORD also employs another 1,000 folks who are not federal employees, including students and postdocs and contractors at sites across the country. So I'm going to talk kind of from the perspective of science, the science enterprise at EPA, but you'll readily see that everything else depends on it. And I'm going to talk about five dimensions of ORD, the Office of Research and Development. And I promise they'll be brief. But so one is that ORD was created under the authority of the Environmental Research, Development, and Demonstration Authorization Act of 1978. That's a mouthful. But the point is, it actually is created under a federal statute. And you hear critics of ORD saying, well, there's no statutory authority for ORD. That's just not supported by the legal facts. ORD, EPA is unique among regulatory agencies in having its own in-house research and development office. You may have heard about the recent elimination of NIOSH, which deals with occupational safety and health. NIOSH supports OSHA, a separate agency, the Occupational Safety and Health Agency, and they're separate. ORD is within the agency. The big advantage of that is that the scientists in ORD have direct access to understand the needs of decision makers in the policy offices that deal with air, water, land, and chemical regulation at the headquarters level. But what's less known is EPA has 10 regional offices. All of them have science needs to inform decisions on permitting, site cleanup and emergency response, where they look to ORD for the science to support those decisions. And then you'll hear this administration, actually the last administration that I was part of, talk about cooperative federalism and the important role of the states. Well, states, just about every state has an environmental quality agency of some kind or other. And those states are dealing often with delegated authorities to do their own permitting and their own cleanup and emergency response decisions. But they, by and large, do not have resources to do any research. And so they look to EPA and specifically to the Office of Research and Development for the science to inform local decisions. The agency has a special relationship with tribal nations. It's a nation-to-nation relationship. And tribal nations are way under-resourced. One of the things I really enjoyed the most was being part of the ORD EPA Tribal Science Council and working with tribal leaders across the United States to understand and deliver science that they need, and to do so collaboratively in partnership with the tribes. State and local agencies, like, for example, what does a local wastewater or drinking water utility do about PFAS? Those decisions really affect local utilities at the city level, the county level, sometimes the town level, or a community that has a small system. They have no resources to understand what to do about those challenges. So all of these folks look to ORD. So ORD deals with all the environmental media, air, water, land, deals with chemicals in those media, deals with what we call the source to outcome continuum of the emissions of or release, the fate and transport of those, the exposure that people and the ecosystem has, what are the adverse effects to people and ecosystems, and what do we do? What can we do to mitigate that? What are the management options? And so, for example, ORD does that in the PFAS space, and I could go into tremendous detail there, but I won't for now. So I've already laid out multimedia, source to outcome, the different decision makers that ORD deals with, the different types of decisions. The other thing I want to highlight is the people of ORD, that these are physical, chemical, biological scientists, they're computer scientists, they're engineers, they are social and behavioral scientists, because the environmental challenges we face are inherently interdisciplinary and require an all hands on deck approach to dealing with grand challenges. And so this is not something that you can cut into pieces and throw people away and then just have a few people left over and have any sense of being able to address that. The other thing I'll say is that ORD is the engine for the agency to have what's called best available science. And if you look at federal statutes, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Toxic Substances Control Act, and on, those are the statutes that give EPA its authority to regulate. Those are statutes passed by Congress and signed by a president. And the courts expect the agency to follow the law. The law requires that the agency base its decisions on science, and the courts at the federal level have had a lot to say about what is adequate science to inform decisions. And sometimes it's, the courts have affirmed what the agency has done, and sometimes the courts have castigated the agency for not doing enough. But it's clear that science has to be foundational to EPA's mission to make decisions to benefit the public. And so, when we look at these proposed cuts with all of that context, you can imagine what's lost if we don't have the functionality of an Office of Research and Development to develop and provide that science. And the question I often get is, well, if ORD goes away, can someone else provide that science? And I would say the answer is no. Yes, there are people, and I'm an academic. I've done academic research for over 3 decades. I've done science that I think is helpful to the agency, but I am not connected with the decision makers the way that an ORD scientist is. I don't really know what they need. And I'm not held accountable to deliver a product that's useful to a policy office the way an ORD scientist is. So ORD is really good at what we call science translation, and is good at being accountable, but is also good at being independent because it's a separate office, that the policy office can't really tell ORD how to do the science. It can say what science outcomes, what science questions it would like ORD to address, but it can't dictate the answer, and it can't tell the scientists how to do the science. And so having that scientific integrity gives credibility and robustness to what the agency does. So I will just say another dimension is the workforce of the future. I mentioned about students and postdocs being integral to ORD. When I was in the leadership role there, something we often talked about is we look to postdocs and students to bring new ideas into ORD, into EPA, and that's how we stay fresh and current. What signal is this administration sending to college students or to high school students about the value that the country sees in STEM education and the value of a STEM workforce? Look at ORD and NOAA. My father worked 20 years at NOAA. I could give a similar talk about NOAA and other federal agencies. That these are folks who are public servants. They care about the mission. They care about serving the public. And also they are responsive to priorities of new administrations. So if a new administration, for example, wants to focus on artificial intelligence, which this administration has said they want to do, they're experts at EPA who can do that. But they have to also focus on the lawful mission of the agency. So I think, Derek, I'll stop there and kick it back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. I think I like the way the questions in the chat are being collected. So I would encourage everybody to post more there. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer a few minutes of my thoughts on the question that was given to me. And then I don't want to have to interrupt any conversation that comes out of the chat. So I think I'll just turn to that after I say a few words. The question that was put to me was, how would any sort of budget cuts and political changes possibly affect action on climate change? And so, especially with the possible action on pricing the emissions that cause climate change. So I think I'll answer that by partly giving a summary of how we think about climate change and what we're doing, and think about how each area might be affected. So the way economists typically think about climate change is that markets work when costs are priced properly. You can go to the store and know how much the cost of something tells you the value of the resources used to make it, and you decide whether it's worth buying it. If it's worth buying it, then you got more value out of it than the resources it costs to make it, and that's a good thing. What climate change is, it's considered an externality. So there's a cost that's a real part of making a product or disposing of the greenhouse gas waste from making the product that's not fully reflected in the price. And so when things are free, like if candy's free, you eat too much of it. And if these costs are not fully priced, then we tend to use too much of it. So to economists, the first order goal is to figure out what that cost is that is missing from prices and bring that back into the price system. The lingo for that nowadays is the social cost of carbon. So the private cost of carbon might be pretty low, might be zero, meaning that we don't actually pay much for disposing of carbon in the atmosphere. But there is still a real social cost in that it contributes to climate change, which imposes cost over time and over space. So a major goal of economists has been to figure out what the social cost of carbon is. And this has been implemented in the US via governmental updates to this number. And this has been a big project. Each of the last few administrations has had a big project of trying to revise this number and catch it up with the latest political preferences and science, a combination of the two. There are some parts of it that are really more science-based and some that are a little bit more preference-based, like how much do you care about the future versus the present? There's no one obvious right answer. You can debate that back and forth a little bit. So one of the first order things that's going to happen, and how does this number used? So whenever the U.S. government, proposes a policy, has to undertake what's called a cost-benefit analysis of that policy. So what are the benefits? What are the costs? And is it worth it? The law, to my understanding, is not as a rule that you can only do it if this analysis turns out positive, but it really helps to have a positive number there when you're trying to defend a certain kind of policy or to promote it. The social cost of carbon is an important input to that process, because if you don't have a price to use in carbon emissions, then that's just going to be left out of these calculations. And for a long time, when agencies price carbon, they use their own numbers. And it's kind of silly. There's one cost and the whole government uses the same number. So the most likely outcome there is that number is going to go way down and possibly even disappear entirely. Would that actually affect much in practice? It's actually really hard to say. I don't know if there's a lot of hard evidence that the number on the social cost of carbon has actually played a swing role in any particular regulation in practice, what would happen on the ground. I know there are some where I've heard people say it mattered. It's hard for me to know what that would mean in terms of like overall U.S. emissions or coordination with other countries. It's certainly a signal that the U.S. isn't taking it very seriously. And the U.S.'s numbers tend to do spill over into other countries, but it's not completely clear how much changing that number actually matters for emissions within the U.S. It certainly matters for evaluations of policies, but whether it matters for what's already implemented on the ground, I think is a little bit harder to say. As part of the process of updating it the last time, there was a process of revising the way the U.S. government does cost-benefit analysis. This was called the revisions to Circular A4. That was a pretty big deal. It required a lot of effort. It went through, I mean, there's a whole lot of effort to sort of redo this and like sort of relay the groundwork for how we do cost-benefit analysis. I would expect there to be some changes to that process, or for it even to be unwound. That would affect all the numbers coming out of the government, evaluating every policy. Whether you think that matters, again, depends on your view of to what extent governmental policy actually relies on cost-benefit analysis versus it's a tool that's used within the policymaking process. But you know that I would expect that process to change, and maybe a lot of those recent changes to be undone. All the groundwork's still there. You can imagine next administration, things snap back to the way they were. And then again, this has cost because now things are kind of bouncing around. The U.S. government doesn't have consistency over time. I'm not a politician. I really can't speculate any more than that about how that would matter. Moving to more concrete, a lot of, as I think David mentioned originally, a lot of the actual policies in the U.S. for climate change are really state and local policies. So you think about the states that are in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Emissions Initiative. This is a cap and trade system among some U.S. states. California's got policies. Other states do their own things. There's a lot of local policies as well. I think the U.S. is often thought to be doing less than it is because other countries might not always appreciate how federal we really are. But I have seen reports that there could be moves to disrupt the ability of state and local governments to undertake their own policies. And that would be a very massive shift. It doesn't seem clear to me why one couldn't undertake policy experiments at a subnational level. And if experiments don't work well, they don't work, and the state or locality bears the cost. And if they do work, other people can adopt it. It doesn't seem to be something that needs to be dictated from higher up. But I don't know if that will actually happen, but I have read at least news reports of possible moves to undo that. What the U.S. federal government has mostly done is non-pricing policies. In particular, under the Biden administration, there was a big push to offer funding for both R&D and for sort of in-the-ground investments that might enable a transition to a lower carbon economy. That's much harder to forecast. A lot of these policies are placed in solidly Republican or Republican-leaning districts, and I think the members in those districts often don't necessarily want them to go away. I mean, a lot of electric car plants are in Georgia, for instance. So what's going to happen to those policies is hard to know. They might be repackaged and might end up having the same rough effect. It's really, I mean, again, I'm not a politician, but that's a lot of where the action has been in the U.S. And those policies aren't perfect. Economists aren't completely in love with them, but they do have some effect, and that has been the main tool of the U.S. government. International coordination, I mean, you couldn't tell, to me, I'm not a political scientist or a politician, so you could tell stories where the U.S. going backwards makes things fall apart. You could tell stories where it makes other countries push harder and like really coalesce and makes more firm commitments. And, honestly, I think either of these is plausible. I don't really have anything more to say. A couple less obvious ones that I want to conclude with. One is data. So a lot of what we know about the world comes from the government being the eyes on the world and academics and scientists then taking that data to learn about the world. And that to me is potentially, we will never be able to know what it is we didn't know because we lost access to data that either wasn't collected or that was no longer posted in a free way. And that, had we not discovered the ozone hole when we did, things would have been a lot worse, but we did discover it. We did learn about climate change kind of in time to do something about it. If we hadn't known about these threats or about PFAS or about others, the consequences could have been a lot worse. Technology, I think we've gotten really lucky. I think if you had asked any of us in 2005 if we would take the current technology deal with the cost of electric cars, the cost of solar, the cost of batteries, any of us would have said, absolutely, this is like our best case outcome. So we've had a great run with technology. It makes dealing with climate change look affordable in a way it didn't always. That said, technology isn't formed in a vacuum, and having a stable, predictable policy environment really sets the tone for what long-term investments you would undertake. And sort of the instability in U.S. policy is, to me, as much of a threat as what the actual level of the policy is at any given time. Finally, adaptation. So adaptation in climate change refers to doing things that are going to reduce the damage that you experience from climate change. So you might, if you have a house near the coast, you might put it in stilts, or your municipality might build a seawall, or sort of classic examples. I've done work showing, I was also very happy your energy return, energy investment come up, to my surprise, because I'm currently working on that. But I've done work on NOAA forecast as adaptation measures. People really use weather forecasts. You can see it in the data. If a given, especially a hot day, this is less relevant in cold, but on a hot day, if it's well forecasted, it doesn't tend to kill that much. But if it's poorly forecasted, you can see it in the data where the deaths go up. I think there are interesting questions around to what extent forecasts should be publicly versus privately provided. The U.S. government has always had deals with media companies about how forecasts are distributed. There is no weather service app for reasons relating to these sorts of deals. But we're not only, I don't see a huge advantage to getting NOAA out of the forecasting game. It seems to me like it'd be largely complementary to any private production there would be. And on top of that, a lot of what NOAA does is collect the data and distribute the data and plug into data coming from other countries that then goes to private forecasters that enables them to make forecasts. And any disruption to that flow, we would see that in the quality of weather forecasts pretty quickly. And there is a role for AI in improving weather forecasts, but I think it's going to be complementary to the role of the big models we typically run. It's not going to replace them, and it still is going to need data. You can't just run it free of any sort of data, and NOAA is really critical for that. So I think I will just, the final thing I'll say is that why, because it's sort of the prompt, like why do we not have more carbon pricing in the US? I think there's partly an academic, for lack of a better word, failure, but it's more just it's a hard problem. Economists don't have one carbon price they can recommend. You can convince me anything from $10 a ton to $1,000 a ton is ballpark reasonable. And the inability to speak with a single clear voice based on data about what the damages from climate change actually are is, I think, a major hindrance toward putting a price in place, because the price starts looking more political. I think it's inherently just a hard problem to know what climate change will do. I don't think it's that we're not looking hard, but climate change is just inherently hard and uncertain in that way. And there's always going to be a lot of room for political maneuver for that reason. We're just never going to get a firm academic answer. Okay, we have a lot of questions piling up. I want to start jumping into some of these, and I really appreciate everybody offering their comments and for Global Salon for hosting this. So I'll start with the one that was posted a while ago. So we've talked about how the balance of economic growth, environmental protection might be shifting, and has shifted back and forth over time. Whoever wants to jump in, what are your thoughts on sort of the best way to balance these objectives? I mean, there's always trade-offs at some margin. And so what are your thoughts about who should be making these trade-offs and how to judge these trade-offs?
Sorry, I'm just going to jump in with a quick comment that it's a flaw, that I think the logic is flawed, that it's a trade-off.
Okay.
And now I'm going to turn it over to others to expand that. But the very premise of it being a trade-off it's a false dichotomy.
David or Chris, either you'd like to jump on that? I know David said something about that earlier.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that the pollution control activities of the federal government have hurt the economy at all. I think that it's a stimulus to the economy. And now it may hurt particular pieces of the economy, which are particularly polluting, but that's an advantage for the overall economy.
Chris, do you have something you want to add? No?
Yeah, I mean, I think I generally agree. I was on an advisory committee for EPA on the review of the lead air quality standard, not the most recent, there's currently a review underway, but this was about 12 years ago. And one of the things we thought about is, as the agency reduces the lead standard, one of the industries affected by that is something called secondary lead acid battery recycling. And that's when you take your car battery back to get it recycled, it goes somewhere to recover the lead. And some of that industry has been moving from the United States to Mexico. And we decided, we were a science advisory committee, but we decided we wanted to at least give our opinion to the EPA administrator. So we wrote a policy paragraph that we acknowledge this is not science advice. However, we recommend in the Commission on Environmental Cooperation, I think it's called the CEC, which I think has now been dissolved by this administration, is a cooperative between Canada, the US, and Mexico. And one of the things that addresses are these kinds of environmental inequities. And we just highlighted that as something that, we thought the US could find ways to provide support to Mexico to enable them to develop more stringent regulations so that it is at least a level playing field on the environmental side. But yeah, I would say by and large, pollution is the result of a market failure. And I think Derek was alluding to this when he talked about social costs, that it's an externality, that a ton of pollution is not priced in the market. There's no transaction price. And if I drive my car by you and emit nitrogen oxides and you breathe it and you have an asthma attack, there's no way for you to come after me for compensation in the market. I mean, you might be able to sue me through tort law, but you're not going to be able, there's no transaction that you didn't buy that gram of NOx from me. And so that's something I've taught in my air pollution control course for decades. And I think it's sort of an aha moment for students. It's like, oh yeah, this is why we need regulation, is to correct market failure. And the market is inefficient when it fails, and it just fails to put a price on pollution, even though there's real damage from pollution. So I think in general, that speaks to the point that, these market corrections through regulation actually provide benefit, including economic benefit, because they do put a price on pollution, at least implicitly, and then that spurs innovation. I think one example, and I'll stop there, is think about what is the most innovative control technology that's had the most effect on public health. And I would challenge you to come up with an answer other than the catalytic converter for an automobile. Because there was one study, and it's an outdated study, that found that the catalytic converter reduced something like 4 billion pounds of emissions. You just think about how many cars have had catalytic converters for decades now, and we just take it for granted. And the price of those has come down because of innovation. When those were first required to meet the performance standards, industry was screaming, the auto industry will go out of business. And now it's like $100. Well, it's probably more than that, but now it's just an accepted part of what needs to be in a car. And just like, we have airbags in cars too, and there's an industry that supports that and does a lot of really high tech innovation.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate you bringing the catalytic converter into this as an example. I mean, the tailpipes are literally where we breathe. Like, I think the benefits from that are huge. I'll just add a couple things. One is, I'm not in the camp that thinks that really managing climate change would be free or even necessarily dirt cheap. Like, I do think that there are, or at least can be, if you regulate enough, a real cost to environmental regulation. I agree strongly with everyone that innovation tends to make those costs less than we anticipate. That's been the historical experience, and I tend to be optimistic about our ability to find new ideas whenever we start looking for them and we're incentivized to look at them. So I'm willing to believe the cost will be a lot less than anybody anticipates they will be, and there already are a lot less than people would have anticipated 10, 15, 20 years ago. But I'll also make the point that if there are no costs, it means we're not doing enough. Because we should be regulating to the point where there are at least some costs in terms of lost consumption. And this is what the social cost of carbon is. It's saying that there's real benefits of having less emissions. And if you're not bearing, just because something is a little bit costly doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. We pay cost all the time when we buy food and do all kinds of stuff because we get value out of that. And so obviously, it depends on how big the cost is, but you want to bear some cost for environmental regulation because you're getting a benefit back. And if that cost is worth it, then it's the right thing to be doing. So to the extent that climate change is currently really is not affecting our ability to deal with it is not affecting economic growth, that would say to me more that we're just not regulating it enough. We should be working a little harder because there are real benefits to doing something. It doesn't mean that's hard to say where you should stop. You don't want to go too far over the line. But there are benefits as well as costs you need to think about.
I want to interject one thing, and that is it's not all about costs and growth. It's also about people's health and well-being, because ultimately, why do we have an economy? It's for health and well-being. And that is at fundamental risk from deregulation and from the dismantling of ORD, the dismantling of NOAA and other scientific organizations, and putting and intimidation of scientists. That's what's at risk, health and well-being.
So I want to shift. Thank you for those comments. I want to shift to a couple other questions around students thinking about entering the workforce. And some of it is both, what are you thinking about the possibility for positions in the next few years? And some of it is if like you are beginning to study something and wanting to go into a line of work related to maybe environmental science or environmental engineering, what are the areas that you would think might be in demand, I guess maybe in general, and might still be in demand even if funding were to decline to governmental agencies? And I will defer to all of you on this one.
I'll just start and say that I've worked in this field of environmental protection and clean energy and climate, and it's a very rewarding field. You know, I encourage people to move into it. There are a lot of different ways to move into it. There's policy, there's science, there's engineering. And I would just say that it's very rewarding work, and don't be discouraged. These jobs will, if the jobs and government service. So these are very rewarding careers, and you know, it's a real benefit to work in a job that has a purpose, public service of some kind, and that's true in industry as well as government. So. Yeah, for people coming up through their education, it's good to get as much technical experience as you can. That was one thing I would have done differently than when I was a student. If I knew what I knew now, you know, get some technical capacity in one thing or another, data science or engineering or chemistry. You know, that all those skills are really needed, and these jobs will come back.
Yeah, if I could just echo something Miriam said earlier about critical thinking, is that, you know, regardless of what discipline you're in, whether you're an English major or an engineer, you're learning critical thinking. You're learning how to synthesize information, how to make inferences. Those very fundamental skills will serve you well in really any endeavor. I'll also say that, you know, I think what we're undergoing now is ultimately going to be a waste of time, in the sense that we have this huge opportunity cost of really important challenges that we're being told we have to look the other way on. Climate change. It's not going to go away. You know, we have to look the other way on environmental justice. That's not going to go away. We could go on and on, right? So the problems, if anything, are probably, unfortunately, going to get worse. And so that means there'll be even more need to have you as a, you know, ready and prepared person to step in and engage, and do that, you know, in a wide variety of ways, whether it's public service as a government employee. We're seeing state agencies stepping up to say, "Hey, we want to hire people." You know, we see the federal government's laying off people. We want to hire you, and you know, nonprofits, foundations, and so on. So, you know, we've had these kinds of blips, maybe not quite like this, but there have been ebbs and flows in the environmental field for decades, and those cycles will come and go. And you know, I just think the need is going to be there, and we need to be ready. We need you to be ready.
And Miriam?
I think what's most important, and my colleagues have said this, what your education does is to train you to think in a particular way. So when you go through engineering, it's a particular type of framework versus, say, philosophy. But what you're doing is you're training your mind to problem solve. And the most important skill that you need moving forward is the flexibility of problem solving, because the problems are always shifting and adapting, or shifting and changing. So you need to have the creativity, grounded, as David said, in fundamental skills. So it's the flexibility, and you know what you really need? Perseverance. You really need perseverance. You get discouraged and you get bad news, and you just have to get up in the morning and you just keep going because you have no choice. And actually, Most parents know that. But anyways, that's what you need is perseverance. And you know what? That the glass is half full. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'll just add two things. One is I mentioned earlier that we got lucky with technology. I think that's actually underselling what we did, and because it's not just that technology appeared out of nowhere, it's because there are a lot of people who kept pushing to discover new ideas and make new ideas happen, and not just make them physically possible, but make them cheap enough to actually be actualized and actually used. And so it wasn't just that EV batteries became a thing and got cheap. And it wasn't just that solar panels got cheap. It's that people made them cheap. And so there, even when regulation is necessarily not necessarily at your back, there's still people who persevere and pushing on margins anyway, just to see where they go. And our views of which technologies are the best change over time. If you had asked us to pick a winner 30 years ago in cars, you would have said fuel cells are the future. 25 years ago, you would have said biofuels. 20 years ago, you might have said some other form of biofuels or maybe like a plug-in hybrid. And then it turns out it's like going straight to electric cars, basically. Looks like it's maybe this will be wrong now. But these opinions change. And so you just got to sort of follow your intuition and follow your North Star, and things will kind of come around if they work out. And if not, you kind of keep trying and keep trying things, and eventually something works out for someone. We're kind of all in this together. The other side is that to the extent that you're working on environmental problems, as a society, we've reached a point in our income, at least at an aggregate level, where I think what's scarcer is actually environmental quality and health, and not material objects as a rule. And as we get richer and richer, the value we're going to place in those things is going to keep going up. And so these problems, not only are they not going away because it's almost like whack-a-mole at some level, but also for a given problem, the value we attach to it is going to keep going up. And so this field's going to continue to persevere because the problems aren't going away, and their importance is only going up over time, I believe. So with that, I think we're at the end of our time. I really appreciate all the panelists. I appreciate all the questions. I hope we got to just about all of them. And I thank the organizers for inviting us.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Well
Thank
done,
you.
Derek. Nice to see
Yeah.
you, Chris.
Yep. Good to meet all of you.
Great statements, Mary.